how that funding is structured. Next slide. So let's start by walking through exactly what is included in prevention under the Act. First, the who. The Family First Act says that the children that are allowed to benefit from the prevention funding are those that are candidates for foster care, and that's defined as those that are at imminent risk of entering foster care. We'll talk about what this means in a moment. In terms of the what is covered, the prevention services that can be funded with the federal funds are mental health services, substance abuse prevention and treatment, or in-home parent skill-based programs. In terms of where the children have to be in order to receive these services, they have to either be living in the home of a parent or in the home of a relative. Notably, the prevention plan that has to be created can specify that the child is to live with a kin caregiver until the child can be safely reunified, or alternatively, a kin caregiver who the child will live with permanently. We'll discuss this more, but the idea that the law allows for a child to be removed from a parent and permanently placed with a relative outside of foster care gave me pause, because that means the child's being subject to a permanent plan other than remaining in that home of parent without the benefit of a lawyer, without the more robust family reunification services offered to children in foster care, and without being able to access permanency supports like adoption assistance and subsidized guardianship. Like I said, we'll get back to that, but I just wanted to note that. In terms of the how long, prevention services under the Act are limited to 12 months for a 12-month period. And then the last thing I would note here that we're going to discuss more is the services have to be a promising, supported, or well-supported practice, as well as subject to a well-designed and rigorous evaluation. So let's get into the details of that. Next slide. Let's return to the first prong. Who is eligible for prevention services under the Act? And in California, this is one of the areas we identified as a problem with the language that the bill uses, because the prevention services are limited to children who are candidates for foster care, which is defined as a child who's at imminent risk of entering foster care. This means abuse has already occurred and been substantiated and has been determined serious enough that the state agency is involved for the purpose of removing the child. The child is a step away from foster care. We know that that's what imminent risk means because that term is already used in current law. States can currently use federal funds for administrative costs for children who are candidates for foster care, which is also defined in current law as those children who are at imminent risk of removal from the home. As you can see from the slide, the Child Welfare Policy Manual provides clarity in terms of what that means, and they say it is not just children who are involved with the child welfare agency, it is those children who are involved for the sole purpose of either removing the child from the home or satisfying reasonable efforts to avoid removal. This is important because a response that we've received to some of the concerns California has raised is that there will be additional guidance or regulations to address the concerns that we have, and that states will be able to interpret some of these provisions broadly. However, it's much more difficult to do that when the terms are already being utilized in existing law and have already been interpreted in existing regulations. It also means that simply issuing program instructions to clarify what this means won't be sufficient because we already have regulations on this effect. And it takes more time than is left with this administration to promulgate new regulations. And to the extent that there are already court decisions out there that have clarified or defined what these terms mean, the only way to overcome any narrowing of the definition through those court decisions would be to have a statutory change that has the term used more broadly. Next slide. So what's the solution? The solution would be to amend the bill to allow for prevention services to be provided for earlier in a child welfare case, not just at the point of imminent risk of removal. We believe the goal of prevention should be to prevent abuse and neglect, not just to prevent entries into foster care. And the earlier you target prevention services, the more likely you are to avoid that abuse and neglect in the first place. Next slide. The next problem California identified is that the prevention services are too narrow in scope because they only include federal funding for mental health treatment, substance abuse prevention, and in-home parent skill-based programs. While we understand that the Act cannot fund everything because of fiscal constraints, the services that were ultimately selected to be funded are a big concern because they're really targeted at the bio family and not the kinship caregiver that the bill anticipates the child may be living with while the prevention services are being provided. This leaves the person doing the actual caregiving of the child vulnerable. Next slide. To understand that concern more fully, it's important to consider who our kinship caregivers are. The Alliance for Children's Rights represents more than 4,000 kinship caregivers every year in Los Angeles. We've advocated extensively for increased supports and equal funding for kin families. And the reason we focus on kin is because our kin caregivers are really the backbone of our child welfare system. And they are in this bill, too. The bill anticipates preventing entries into foster care by relying on kin families to step up and care for these children. But when you look at who these families are and consider what we're asking them to do, it underscores the need for prevention that's targeted at meeting the needs of these caregivers as well. Our kin caregivers are a very vulnerable population, as anyone who works with them can attest to. Many of them are older. A huge percentage of them are living below the federal poverty line, which is a very poor measure of poverty. In California, a study done out of UCLA found that when they used 200% of the federal poverty line as a measure for how families were doing, there were still 2/5 of grandparents who were responsible for their grandchildren in this state who did not have enough income to make ends meet. Many of our kinship caregivers have disabilities, and they also haven't really set aside the time emotionally, financially, just in terms of their daily lives to be able to be prepared for taking in a child who's in crisis, because children come to kin families in an instant. All of that is to point out that our kinship families are vulnerable and in need of support. We need them, we rely on them, this bill relies on them, but they need support to be able to do what we're asking them to do. Next slide. And the discussion draft of the Family First Act that was introduced by Senator Wyden in 2015 included a much broader array of services. Again, of course, not all of these things were going to make it into the final bill because of fiscal constraints. But the things in orange that are highlighted in orange, those are the sorts of services that provide concrete support to kin families. Funding for transportation, respite, childcare, utility payments, support to address issues in inadequate housing. None of those things were actually included in the bill as introduced. And what that means practically is we're asking kin families to step in and take in children in crisis, often because of a parent who's dealing with addiction and mental health problems. And in order for that relative to allow that parent to access the treatment services that this bill offers, the relative has to take that child in outside of the foster care system without any real supports, without funding, without services. Next slide. And that's not currently what states are doing to support these families. And this is another point that we've heard. One of the arguments we've heard for the need to pass Family First is that the waivers are expiring, and in order to continue to provide services that states are providing now through their waivers, we have to have this bill. But when you look at how the waiver dollars were actually being used, you see that states were using their waiver dollars to provide some of those concrete supports and services to kin families. But because the Family First Act does not provide the federal funding for those same services, when those waivers expire, states are going to have to backfill with state funds or cease providing those services to families. And that's going to be true regardless of whether Family First passes or not. Next slide. So what's the solution? It would be to amend the bill to provide for prevention services that support both the kinship caregiver who's stepping in to support that young child or that youth, as well as to support the reunification efforts. Next slide. So that brings us to the problem that for me is one of the fatal flaws of this bill, and that is that the Act doesn't just fail to provide support to kin caregivers during that limited amount of time that the family is receiving prevention services. The bigger problem for me is when the prevention services don't work and the next step becomes necessary, and that's removal, formal removal from the home and entry into foster care. the child is no longer eligible for federal foster care funding if that child was living in the home of the kinship caregiver for more than 6 months, which of course this bill allows them to do. The bill allows the child to be living outside that home of removal in that kinship home for up to 12 months. And there's no safeguards to make sure that the child doesn't lose their eligibility for federal foster care benefits if they ultimately come into foster care. And that's because there was no change to the current rule that's in statute that says that child has to be physically living in the home they're removed from in either the month the removal petition is filed or one of the 6 months prior to the removal petition being filed. And it's a complicated rule, so next slide, let's look at how it would play out in real life. And we did a little hypo. So Alex's father is in prison, and his mother's addicted to heroin and unable to care for him. And child welfare's gotten involved and located Alex's grandmother, who's living on a fixed income and really desperately wants to help both her daughter and her grandson. So she takes in Alex while his mother goes into a residential treatment program paid for through the Family First Prevention Services Act. After 7 months in rehab, Alex's mother relapses and is living on the streets. Alex's grandmother is desperate. She does not have support or resources. She wasn't planning to care for Alex permanently and on an ongoing basis, so she turns to child welfare. If they open up a foster care case at that point, Alex is no longer eligible for federal foster care payments because he was living outside of the home he's going to be removed from, outside of his mother's home and in his grandmother's home for more than 6 months. Under this scenario, many would say the state did the right thing by trying to avoid that entry into foster care so that Alex's mother could access substance abuse treatment with the help of the new prevention dollars. That's what this act is encouraging. The problem is it does not account for the backup plan. Instead, it renders children ineligible for ongoing foster care benefits if the children have to come into care. And who this ultimately impacts is the kin families. Many states will be deterred from taking that next step and moving the child into foster care when reunification fails. And the Family First Act envisions this, allowing the prevention plan that's created for the child to have the child permanently moved into a relative's home. But even if they're not deterred, many states are not going to equally fund that relative even when the child comes into care. Remember, these children are no longer federally eligible. And while the Supreme Court has said children who are federally eligible have to be provided equal funding, whether in a relative or non-relative home, that Supreme Court decision says nothing about inequitable treatment for children who are not federally eligible. And states have a variety of practices to treat children who are placed in foster care with kin differently and to provide them less support than those that are placed with non-relatives. California, in fact, had a long history of denying state foster care benefits to children with relatives when they weren't federally eligible. And other states do the same through having a different approval standard for their relative caregivers. In this way, Family First is doing the opposite of creating a continuum of care for high-risk children. Instead, it's encouraging states to attempt that prevention. And then if services don't work, and if they were provided to a child who is living outside that home of removal, it punishes the state and ultimately the caregiver for that effort by denying them ongoing access to federal foster care funding. And it also means they're denied ongoing access to federal subsidized guardianship payments and adoption assistance payments. It's a lose-lose for relatives. Prevention should not be done on the backs of vulnerable caregivers, and we shouldn't be investing funding for prevention only to take it away from children who need to ultimately come into foster care. Next slide. The solution is to amend the bill to clarify that a child can be residing either in the home of removal or in the home of the caregiver or specified relative who is not the home of removal. The solution is not just clarifying that the parent's home is the home of removal. Federal law already allows that. The problem is that what the law says right now is the child has to be physically residing in the home that they're removed from. So that constructive removal, even if the child's living with the relative, but they're constructively removed from mom's house, doesn't overcome the problem because the child wasn't physically residing in that home of removal. What we need is for there to be no clock ticking when you move that child into the relative's home in order to provide the prevention services. Another solution would be to amend the bill to require that any child receiving preventive services in a kinship setting do so through a voluntary placement agreement. Voluntary placement agreements are allowed currently under federal law, but we've learned that very few states and jurisdictions actually utilize them. The benefit of a voluntary placement agreement is twofold. First, the relative would actually receive foster care funding while under the voluntary placement agreement, and that means concrete supports to the families. The second is the VPA actually includes a safeguard that says we have to do a review within 180 days to see if formal removal is necessary, and that would preserve that eligibility for foster care benefits. But like I said, very few states and jurisdictions use VPAs. You would actually need to amend the statute to make this a requirement for using the prevention services while the child is in that relative's home. Next slide.
Angie, I'm going to chime in because we have a number of questions about the Alex scenario specifically. I hope that's okay. And I know if we'll get to the end, Alex will be a memory. So why, first just why isn't Alex's grandmother receiving a TANF-only benefit? And what would be wrong with that?
So Alex's grandmother, while he's residing with her, could receive the child-only benefit through TANF. I would say that is a source of support, but often a very limited benefit to families, especially in many states where the TANF funding provides, just $100, $150 a month to that family. So it's quite short of what the families often need in order to really have support and services. But yes, that's true. They could get a child-only TANF grant.
Understanding the considerable differential, at least in California. Another question is, why isn't Alex in drug treatment with his mother? And it kind of follows up with a comment. It says, California hasn't invested in residential programs for parents to keep custody during treatment. It currently is very limited, but the Family First would expand those services and keep kids with their birth parents in treatments which is best for the child and parent and grandmother. So what's your reaction to that?
My reaction to that would be that would be a possibility, and that's true, it's a possibility under the Family First Act, but the particular problem that I'm pointing to that maybe is not, maybe this scenario isn't the perfect scenario to illustrate the problem, is that it isn't always safe to keep the child with that bio parent. And in fact, the bill anticipates that there are instances when the child needs to actually be removed in an informal way while those prevention services are being provided. And that when states do that thing that the bill anticipates and actually moves the child into the kinship setting, when that's the course that's the best interest of the child, it does start that clock ticking. So that if that child is with that relative for more than 6 months, now they're not eligible for federal foster care benefits anymore. So it's true that this isn't going to play out in every instance that you utilize funding under Family First for the prevention services. But it is going to play out in some of the instances, and when it does play out, it's really doing so in a way that I think is ultimately the most detrimental for our kin families themselves.
Okay, thanks for that. We're going to move on. You've got a lot more content, and we have Kathy and Greg as well, so thank you. But we did get a number of those questions in repeat form, so I wanted to pose those.
Sure, of course. And actually, I'm only going to do one more of the slides on prevention and then turn it over to Kathy, who's going to talk about a few of the prevention issues. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the problem that 2 of the services that are funded through the Act can already be funded with federal dollars through the Medicaid program. And the Family First Act doesn't actually make the services any easier to claim under 4E than they are to claim under Medicaid. So to break that down, the Affordable Care Act actually expanded access to mental health services by deeming mental health an essential health benefit that private health plans have to provide and Medicaid plans have to offer, and by requiring parity, meaning enrollees have to have access to the same mental health services as they have to physical health services. And in addition, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have issued guidance last summer to inform states of opportunities to design delivery systems for supporting enhanced substance use disorder services that integrate with other health and behavioral health treatment. And the federal share of cost for substance abuse treatment services and mental health services under Medicaid is currently 100% federal funds. that's going to go down to 90%, but both of those are more than the 50% offered through the Family First Act. So from a practical standpoint, the question it raises for me is whether or not the federal government should be creating multiple funding streams to fund the same set of services, or if we should be getting our federal dollars to go further and targeting 4E prevention funds at things that are otherwise not funded through current federal sources. So next slide. What I've heard in response to that point, that states can already pay for substance abuse treatment and mental health with Medicaid, is that they don't, and that accessing services under Medicaid and claiming those dollars is difficult. But that seems an odd argument because prevention services are not going to be easier to claim under Family First. So if states have difficulty designing programs that qualify under Medicaid, they may find that they still have problems under this law as well, because this law says that those services have to be promising, supported, or well supported. And while that's good to have them, be evidence-based, some of those, half of them, have to be at that well-supported category, which is the highest classification standard and one that a lot of programs don't currently meet. In addition, all the programs implemented have to be rigorously evaluated, and there's no federal funding available to fund those evaluations. So the CBO has actually estimated that only 30% of the spending on prevention provided by the states that exceeds their MOE will be eligible for federal reimbursement, at least initially under the Act. And that's because of the high standards that the Act set. The CBO does estimate that by 2026, the amount of federal funds states would be able to access after the MOE would increase to 95%. But given the structure of the prevention funding and the significant state investment that's going to be required to get to the point of being able to more fully match those funds that exceed the MOE, which Kathy's going to talk about, I don't know that I'm completely convinced that most states are going to get to that 95% rate. So again, next slide. The solution here would be to amend the bill to fund prevention services that are not already eligible for federal funding through another funding stream. And if the feds are going to require rigorous evaluations, they should be chipping in some funding for those evaluations as well. And as I said, I'm now going to turn it over to Kathy Sunderling, who's going to discuss some of the remaining problems we've identified with Title I and then sort of delve into Title II. Kathy?
Great. Thank you so much, Angie. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining the presentation today. So continuing in the Title I conversation, there are a couple of things from a technical or fiscal perspective that we wanted to include in this section of the presentation because they're really tied to how the funding is identified and shifted from current expenditures or current funding that's owed to states into the ability to provide the prevention services rather than putting forward new federal funding for the prevention services. There are savings and cuts that are assumed that would fund these services and then some. So the first item to talk about here is related to a change in the bill that would essentially delay funding that the federal government would otherwise be owing to states over the next couple of years that states would already have been using for prevention services. Specifically, the Act delays the phase-in of delinking the adoption assistance program from the federal Title IV-E eligibility requirements for a 2.5-year period. This was something that was enacted several years ago as part of one of the bills that Sean mentioned, and so it's been phasing in over time. And states have been required already to reinvest savings from this delinking in prevention services. It could be used without restriction, however, to the individuals that they're providing and the types of prevention the funds could be used for. So essentially, the CBO is estimating that delaying these reimbursements would reduce, in their eyes, either reduce spending on adoption assistance payments on the federal level, meaning states would have to continue to put in their own funding for this program by a total of $720 million over the 10-year period that the CBO looked at. It's around ranging from $50 to $90 million a year when you look at those out years. The irony here for us and the concern is we're essentially taking funding from every state, that would have been able to use these for a broad set of individuals, for a broad set of services, and then through Title I, saying to the states, you can use money for a narrower set of services for a narrower group of people. And so next slide, please. We think the solution here is to not rob Peter to pay Paul. Essentially, rather than narrowing the use of these funds, amend the bill to continue the delinking as planned and continue to open Title 40 for additional prevention services. There were other ways to pay for the new services in Title I that were identified but rejected through the course of the discussions behind the scenes. And so there are ways to make changes in other health and human services area that are not considered cuts and that are not considered to be undoing deals such as the AAP delinking that could actually open up new funding for prevention services rather than taking funding away from states that we were anticipating to be able to use for this broader set of prevention services and instead saying use it instead for these more narrow set of services. Next slide, please. Another technical issue in Title I that is of concern to California and we believe to other states is that the Act requires states to report annually on a number of data points for each individual child receiving prevention services via the Act. This would require states to report a significant level of detail down to the child level, which is really very onerous and unnecessary to be able to monitor the outcomes and determine the success of the Act's changes to the prevention services that are provided. Next slide, please. The solution for this would be to, rather than do child-specific reporting, allow an aggregate data report to be provided for these prevention activities. Really, in amending the bill to allow that, you can achieve the appropriate measurement and the appropriate oversight by the federal government and other stakeholders while avoiding the requirement that you report on each individual child for whom you provide the services. It's an unusual standard in federal reporting and one that we think would make already a difficult prevention process to access these funds even more difficult for states to maintain. And next slide, please. So finally, with regard to Title I, there is a requirement that I think Angie has alluded to in some of her comments, called the maintenance of effort, and that's not unexpected with legislation of this type. The structure of this particular maintenance of effort requirement has raised a number of concerns that we've heard through the discussions. The Act would require states to meet that maintenance of effort to be able to access the new prevention funding. However, the MOE is broadly defined. It includes spending in the TANF program, Title 4B, the Social Services Block Grant, and any other program the state operates. I'll note that it is expressly excluding expenditures that the states make for their waiver programs now, which is a help to those states that have waiver programs, or as in California, those counties that have waiver programs, because not every county operates a waiver program here in California. But for those states that don't have statewide or any waivers, there's no real break there. Any type of spending that you do on prevention in a broad set of categories and a broad set of programs would be required to be reported. So it will be really very difficult for states to be able to maintain over time. And I'll note that the year that is tied to in the legislation is 2014. And that's, you know, we're in the middle of an economic recovery after a long recession, so we expect that many states would have been opening up and doing more of that prevention funding, but given that we're now on a bit of an upswing, there's no provision for the future, for a future economic downturn. The bill would always tie states to that 2014 year, and that has been a concern that has been expressed as well. Next slide. So the solutions for this are statutory in nature. It would be to adopt more realistic and less onerous definitions for the MOE. So amending the bill to limit the MOE to expenditures that are made within the child welfare system, of course, keeping the state waiver expenditures out of that as well. But rather than looking at these other broader programs, especially ones that are constantly in jeopardy, such as the Social Services Block Grant, which has been put up for elimination a number of times over the last several years, to forever hold states to their 2014 spending out of places like that seems extremely onerous for states. As well, allow some provisions for the future if there are economic downturns for states to be able to reduce that MOE requirement. These changes would avoid penalizing states that have already moved forward with prevention programs by carving out funding they've been able to find from other areas of their budget, and it would allow more access to the new prevention services in Title I of the Act. Next slide, please. So a couple introductory comments related to Title II. So Title II of the bill is pretty much all about the types of placements that children in foster care can be placed into and what is required under those placements to be able to receive federal funding for them. The Act has a new definition of a qualified residential treatment program. It's essentially congregate care, a group home type of placement. And it sets forth a number of restrictions on the use of these facilities that we'll talk about in this section, as well as a number of requirements for states and counties to follow when these types of placements are used. So the effects of this title are largely twofold. One is a goal that's been clearly stated and that California has shared and is working toward in our reform efforts that you'll hear about in more detail from Greg Rose, to reduce the use of congregate care for children in foster care, to have more children placed in family settings to the greatest extent possible, and utilize these placements, these group placements, as more of a temporary type of placement, not a long-term type of placement. These are goals that we definitely share. And then the second effect of this title is to cut federal spending to generate savings that will help cover the cost of the prevention services that are laid out in Title I and the section that we just walked you through. We've raised a number of concerns. We'll get into those in a second, and I'll step you through several of the most critical ones. And I do want to say here before launching in that the staff that we've been working with at the congressional level have been great in engaging in a number of conversations with various parties over the last couple of months since the bill was put forward to help us understand their thinking on including some of these and to explore ways to perhaps administratively, through implementation, take care of or reduce the potentially onerous and negative effects of many of these. So what we focused on in this is the issues that really cannot be fixed or could be difficult, if not impossible, to fix administratively, and for which the bill really needs to be amended in order to avoid what we believe are unintended consequences, both for California and the reform efforts that we're embarking on now, but also for other states that are going to be obviously implementing this title of the bill as well, and how that can work for all of you. So next slide, Amy. So the first issue is related to placement limitations in these qualified residential treatment programs. The Act would allow only children with serious emotional or behavioral disorders or disturbances to be placed in a qualified residential treatment program. But states like California are grappling with numerous populations with special needs that can best be met, at least temporarily, in a group setting. Some examples are victims of commercial sexual exploitation, a very growing issue. Congress passed legislation on just recently to place a number of requirements on states and localities to do a better job of identifying and reporting CSEC youth, to do a better job of developing protocols to serve them, and yet this legislation would not enable us to serve them in these group settings, which we've developed and found to be, at least on a temporary basis, very beneficial for these children, unless they can be diagnosed with that serious emotional or behavioral disorder. A couple of other examples would be children with severe medical needs but not behavioral health needs, and children in juvenile justice for whom the alternative is a locked facility. So these are actually step-down facilities for them where they can be receiving therapy, but they just don't always have the serious emotional or behavioral disorder diagnosis that would be required under the legislation. So next slide, please. The proposed solution is to allow the appropriate use of QRTP services for additional children. Our suggested language is to amend the bill to ensure that children with other documented behavioral or therapeutic needs that require the care provided by a QRTP can be utilized for that. This will ensure that states have appropriate placements available while meeting other requirements that are being set forth for timeframes, documentation, and court oversight for children who have needs that are not a severe or serious behavioral health need. We do think that this could be helped to some degree with some administrative interpretation, but it's important to remember that children such as those who are rescued from sex trafficking have huge issues of trust. They often have been failed by the adults that are supposed to have helped them for, at times, years. Law enforcement and other adults in their lives have not helped them. They've locked them up. They've treated them like perpetrators rather than victims. And the recognition now, I think, around the nation, and definitely something that we've been working toward here legislatively this year in California, that these are victims who need to be served through the child welfare system to the greatest extent possible, is critical to think about in looking at this section. In allowing these children to be placed and served in these types of programs is critical, and if that's not able to be done, the behavioral need requirement coupled with the 30-day assessment requirement that I'll address in a couple of slides just means that we are not going to have placement options for these youth even on a short-term basis for them to be able to start healing as needed. Next slide, please. The next concern is related to a requirement in the bill that would require all QRTPs to have registered or licensed nursing staff on site during business hours. There is a colloquy that's been offered by Senators Hatch and Wyden on the Senate floor that suggests that the terms registered or licensed and the term business hours are open to interpretation, that they recognize that children may be at school, for example, and so what we mean by business hours perhaps does not need to include a traditional 8 to 5 business model when kids aren't actually at the home but instead are away for the day at school. The concerns that we have are when the law says registered or licensed, in states like California, we have labor issues, we have the nurses who know what registered or licensed nursing means. And so the law says registered or licensed nursing. If that's not changed and amended in the bill, there are going to be a number of states where it doesn't matter what interpretation is provided or what was said in a colloquy on the Senate floor. What's going to matter is what it says in the law. And so nursing staff are going to need to be put into those homes at least for a number of hours during the day, and that's a concern. It really seems to drive toward, coupled with the behavioral health issue that I just talked about, a medicalization of these types of facilities, which may be appropriate for some children and some populations, but not for all. And it's really without regard to the actual needs of the children who are placed there. So we absolutely agree with the need to ensure that children across the board, not just those placed in residential group care, are receiving appropriate medical care and that they're being seen regularly by doctors and other trained clinical professionals. But there's a number of ways that states can do that. California, for example, has a program of public health nursing where they help to maintain our health and education passports for our youth. And there's other ways that you can make sure that that's happening without having to put an onerous requirement into place that would require these nursing staff. Next slide, please. So our suggestion and our requested amendment to the bill has been to allow for staff in the particular facilities who've been trained to provide the necessary care or emergency care under the direction of licensed or certified medical personnel to meet this requirement. And the suggestion we've also made is perhaps larger facilities, those, for example, with 15 or more beds, which you could think perhaps have more of a medical need, are less family-like in their setting, could also be subject to the requirement more appropriately than a smaller home that serves children that don't have that level of medical need. Next slide, please. The next issue that we've identified, and I alluded to this a minute ago, is a requirement to have assessments completed within 30 days for all qualified residential treatment placements. The children placed in these programs would have to be assessed within that time by a qualified individual, and that's defined in the bill, as needing the defined level of care. And if the assessment is not completed by that day, you essentially forfeit the federal financial participation for the placement. And this really just presumes such a level of availability of mental health professionals and an often just unrealistic ability to assess children who so often have times engaging and bonding. Children who have severe mental health needs, who've been abused, neglected, and suffered the trauma of removal from foster care, often have a difficult time connecting with other adults, and really forging that relationship to even be able to engage in the treatment process. So the 30 days can be unrealistic for those children, and we think that there needs to be some provision in place for times when you're just not able to complete that within 30 days. The work is being done diligently toward achieving that assessment. So next slide, please. The suggested solution is to provide an extension of the 30-day requirement, assuming that the appropriate documentation is included in the child's case file. So we're suggesting up to 60 days if it's documented, and allow the federal funding to continue for that period. Again, assuming we're going to get there, that for whatever reason, whether that's availability of the staff, depending on it's perhaps a smaller county or a smaller state that may not have the qualified individuals who are necessary to be able to perform these assessments. You don't want to have them doing half-hearted or slapped together assessments just to meet the 30-day requirement, that sort of thing. And then after 60 days, it seems reasonable to at least temporarily halt until the assessment is completed, but then turn back on the federal funds once that assessment is completed and they're in compliance with the requirement. We're also suggesting a change to ensure that the initial placement is funded, and assume that states act in good faith when they're placing a child into a QRTP and embarking on the assessment. I'm going to turn it over next to Amy to finish out Title II, but I do just want to sort of wrap up by saying that the CBO in its score for the bill assumes that states will not initially be able to meet the requirements of Title II. Some of the, these new requirements that I've talked through, and also others that we've not necessarily considered fatal flaws, but think could be addressed and changed as well, or perhaps could be administratively changed. They refer to this as limitation on payments, and they assume over a 10-year period, almost $1 billion in savings would accumulate to the federal government from states, at least initially through that 10-year period, being unable to meet the requirements and thus just having to fund the services on their own. And then later over time, that lowers a little bit as they think states would be able to develop alternative placements. Greg is going to get into this, but I just want to say before I pass the baton to Amy that in California, with the continuum of care reform that we've been embarking on, we've been trying to work really hard on thinking about that transition and making sure that there are alternative supported placements for children to go, that you don't just pull the rug out of the entire system and assume that the kids will all land on their feet and land somewhere where they're going to be well served. And the concerns that we have with the very large number of potential cuts to states, no transition funding except a very small amount for family finding that will be quickly spent by states, given the small amount. There's just such a lack of transition planning for changes of this nature, even if fixed as we proposed in our amendments and laid out here in the presentation, will leave a lot of states really holding the bag for children for whom there is no good alternative where the services would be available. So thank you for your time and listening regarding Title II. Amy's going to close that out for us. And so Amy, the ball is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And I just want to highlight, I don't know how it works in your states, but sometimes, the public sector, which is charged with the incredibly difficult work of implementing the child welfare system, and then the child welfare advocates who kind of have the luxury of opining about what's right. We sometimes aren't on the same side of the page. And that's what's so interesting about Family First is the unanimity in California, and I don't want to say to a last person, but largely, and I think Kathy, you did a really amazing job. I mean, Angie pointed out a lot of the things about, how it's impacting children and families, and Kathy's perspective as, what's this going to mean to your public sector agency? Those are both equally valid points of view to think about as you're deciding whether your, local jurisdiction or your state should be concerned about this. So I'm going to just take a moment to talk about a very small placement in California that would no longer be viable under Family First, called THPP. And it's so small, you might wonder, why in the world are we even bothering with it to be concerned about it? Because here in California, we believe this placement, which is a kind of transitional placement for young people aged 16 to 18, it is extremely important for a narrow segment of the foster youth population. And we want to have a child welfare system that can accommodate every individual child, to not shoehorn them into the placements that are available based on someone in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. This placement has been very effective, and the slide shows who it's really keeping safe. One is children who have returned to care from being commercially sexually exploited. This is not an insignificant number of young people, sadly, in our state. And what this placement provides is not just a therapeutic intervention, but it's something that I think many of us who are not as familiar with this population forget. It's also physical safety. It's a level of 24/7 supervision that prevents these young people, often young women, from being assaulted by their perpetrator. And in working closely with Bay Area Youth Centers, a leading provider serving CSAC youth in Alameda County, have really helped us understand how the physical layout of housing, the on-site availability of staffing, that these young people are being literally preyed upon. And in moments of weakness and when our guards are down, they're literally being taken. And I know that sounds very extreme, and I wish it weren't the case, but for these young people, this setting is being very successful. The next group that we really see success with this program is young people who are transitioning from homelessness. Now, I want to point out, this is not necessarily young people who started in foster care. What we're seeing in California is young people who are maltreated, they're 16 years old, and they leave their home of their own accord. They pop up in a homeless youth shelter, perhaps a RHYA shelter. And unlike in decades past, they're seeing our child welfare system, our foster care system, as something that has something to offer. And now that being said, they may have been homeless for 6 months, 12 months. They're not going to just fold into a family setting overnight. We know that is the goal, but this THPP setting has been extremely successful in giving them their autonomy, recognizing that as someone who has lived on the streets for a period of time, they don't see themselves as almost as a child anymore. The goal, however, is a family setting for all children, but it's been a very effective bridge in that way. And then transsexual youth. We're making important strides around LGBTQ young people, but our system is still scratching its head a little bit around how we can really support young people who are transitioning. Our caregivers need more support and training, but we want to create environments where young people can be safe who are having this experience. Now, if you're like me, you're trained in public policy, you know these are very small percentages. But again, why can't we create a system that can accommodate individual young people? That's what we do for our own children who are living in our homes, and we need the flexibility and creativity to sustain creative placements like this. So the solution simply is to amend the bill to allow this kind of effective alternative placement, to monitor it carefully, to not let young people languish in it, but not to simply to cut off this as an option. Now here is the part of the presentation I'm really looking forward to, and it's the opportunity to share with you what we are doing. So we spent the last hour saying our concerns about Family First, the amendments we want to see, and now we want to show you what can be possible. Not to hype it too much, sorry about this, Greg, but I do think that there's been a misperception, and I think this because I've had this conversation 20 times, that we in California do not want to move young people out of group homes. That is not the case. It is how we do it. And I think that our continuum of care reform is doing it responsibly, and it is an approach that can be replicated on the federal level. So over to you, Greg. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, everybody. I wanted to give you a chance. I'm sorry, I'm hearing echo, so I'm on my phone, so I may be having a difficult time being articulate. That said, many of you in California have probably heard this story before, but many of you who live outside of California have not. Our CCCR effort, the Continuum of Care reform effort, actually started as a request from the legislature to look specifically at congregate care reform. And as we started looking at it, it became clear that we couldn't simply change one aspect of the continuum without spending a fair amount of effort looking at the entire continuum of care. And so after some preliminary work, we went back to the legislature and said, you know, if we want to do it right, we need to really pay attention to all of the continuum from congregate care to home-based care and relatives as well. So what ended up occurring was a 2-year stakeholder process with dozens and dozens of meetings, many of them very large, and meetings that occurred throughout the state, that there was representatives from former foster youth, current foster youth, private nonprofit entities, our county colleagues from both behavioral health and child welfare, and on the probation side, parent representatives, tribal representatives. We had input from our legislative staff who are keenly and deeply interested in this topic. And so at the end of a 2-year period, we created a legislative report that really kind of laid out what we think is a thoughtful approach to using congregate care only for very specified purposes, et cetera. And so, at its core, what we're saying is that we think that children should and youth should grow up in families, and families should be supported by nurturing communities, and that youth that need to be served in congregate care should only be served in congregate care if they have specific treatment needs that need to be achieved, and that we should be planning for discharge from day one, so that there isn't a tendency to kind of do the out of sight, out of mind. We literally start discharge planning from the time of admission. That 2-year effort then culminated, that 2-year effort with the legislative report that had 17 different recommendations that I'll spare you from, ultimately turned into a bill that the administration sponsored and was supported by numerous public and private agencies and associations, and that went through the legislative process without a single no vote. And it really established the framework that I'll be talking about now. And there's a couple of key, pillars to the work that we're doing, and that I think are important. So one of the items on the slide talks about the use of the child and family team for assessment and placement options and service needs. And so what we think is that it's really important that a young person and people that are dear to them, and often people that will have and will maintain lifelong connections to them, have a say in what services and supports and where the child will get, and what services and supports the caregivers may need in order to provide a nurturing environment. And if those youth need a more structured environment, the child and family team would weigh in on that as well. We also, and they will continue to monitor the service plan, if you will, and provide ongoing kinds of assessments and ongoing suggestions about how to kind of either titrate services up or down, or how best to provide additional services and supports. And a byproduct often from these teams is that not all the services and supports necessarily need to be government funded. Often members of the child and family team themselves are able to fill very critical niches in social services and or recreational supports, or just some basic concrete services that really fill some gaps, and largely that's through their time and through their effort to support the family and the child where he or she is living. The other important thing another important thing I wanted to mention is that our process that we're rolling out actually really enhances the approval process and our training process for caregivers. So throughout the state, we had historically had 3 different processes for kind of looking at caregivers and doing some assessments. We had a particular process and structure for relative caregivers, a different process and for foster family homes, and then yet a different standard ultimately for families that were going to make lifelong permanent connections through adoption. And what we've done is we've taken the important aspects of all 3 of those and applied them to our relative approval process. So no longer are we simply looking at health and safety kinds of aspects related to our caregivers. We're actually assessing their ability to provide quality care and identifying those areas that they could use additional supports to enhance their ability to be the best caregivers they could be. And so we're spending an enormous time, effort, and dollars in this area as well. I touched briefly on the next bullet around revamping group homes, et cetera. And in our state, the group home category will sunset soon, and it will be replaced by something known as the short-term residential treatment program. And those words were chosen very carefully. Short-term, although undefined, is intended to meet the very specific treatment needs of the youth that are there. Residential, obviously, we expect the whole needs of the child be addressed while in that program. Therapeutic, obviously, because in our view and our assessment during the stakeholder process, the bulk of the services and supports that young people need who end up in congregate care or are a result of trauma and often related and also have unmet mental health needs or very complicated mental health needs, even if they are being addressed. And so in our system, we actually we require the residential programs to have integrated mental health programs and have identified a series of core services, including transitional services that will help transition the young person back to a family-based care. Lastly, at least in this kind of short list of things we've done, because the bill was several hundred pages, we're just pulling out a few highlights. We updated the rate structure for all types. And so one of the things we did, even in anticipation for capacity building, is something that was influenced by the information that Angie provided you today, and she provided us and the legislature previously, was if we think we're going to rely on relatives to provide nurturing homes for young people who have experienced trauma, and given their circumstances, we ought to support them in the same way that we support all other families. And so prior to even implementing this law, we created a structure that allows for relatives to be reimbursed at the same level as any other family. We also have created a number of levels of care for home-based family care, so that the needs of the young person and the ability of the caregiver to meet those needs we're able to then provide certain levels of funding depending on need. In addition to that, for the first time in California at least, in addition to the funding that would go to the family for supporting the care and supervision, if you will, of the young person, we've also created a rate structure that allows for services and supports to those families. So no longer does a family need to be connected solely to a private foster care agency or find their way to a nonprofit to get services. We have created a structure that allows for funding to be to the family that meets the needs of the child, and then a service package to be delivered also. In addition to those things, we're rolling out a treatment foster care program. We have a wraparound project where we have the beginnings of a robust series of mental health, in-home mental health programs that we think we can all weave together to support kids and their families in the community. Next slide, please. So one of the concerns that we've had is, okay, we're well along this path of implementation. Our implementation starts January 1st, 2017. And as we get closer and closer to implementation, there's many moving parts and many issues that still need to be resolved and addressed, and much anxiety and concern. And the Families First Act potentially adds some more complexity and some issues that we need to pay attention to that could actually impede our implementation. Let's talk about a few of those, most of which Kathy has mentioned previously, so I won't get into all the details. But the first bullet talks about this qualified individual to assess for the placement in the QRTP. As I've mentioned earlier, we believe that we'll get much better placement decisions and much better placement decision and better services and supports if those decisions are influenced and recommended by a child and family team process. Rather, a group of people that are invested in the success of that young person, rather than somebody who is from outside the system and has no direct connection to the young person. We're worried that it could be duplicative, or it could water down our child and family teaming process, and frankly it adds another layer of confusion potentially to the process. Should say also that we do have an interdisciplinary process that stays in place for ultimately deciding which youth meet the criteria to be in our short-term residential treatment programs. So it's not as if that there isn't already a process in place that allows for that. It's just not a third-party individual that has no connection to either the placing agency, the funding agency, the mental health agency, et cetera. We have an integrated process that we think we can build on that makes those decisions here in California. Kathy also talked about the medicalization of the program with the nurses. One of the things I wanted to mention also is that, based on case law in California and some lawsuits we had and some other things, is not only are we worried about the potential of having nurses making it more of a medical-like environment rather than a social service, behavioral health kind of environment. We also worry that the substantial rate we've created for the short-term residential treatment programs, which is over $11,000 a month, close to $12,000 a month, would either have to be raised in order to provide nursing care, or we would have to make compromises in the amount of mental health clinical staff that could be available to serve the children. It's a difficult decision, and some of the conversation is, well, gosh, the nurses ought to be funded through Medicaid, which is a possibility, no doubt, which would require an enormous amount contracting between private providers, the county Medicaid agency, et cetera, but also seems to be in conflict with some of the rulings of court in California that have required us to pay the rate through our rate structure that actually meets the needs of the statute. So I wanted to point that out. Kathy also talked about the limitation on congregate care for those youth that have those specialized needs, and we think this is really important for the reasons that Kathy mentioned. And even in our state, when you think about the QRTPs that are potentially alternatives to locked facilities for our juvenile justice, kids that are in foster care but also in the juvenile justice system, we've taken a thoughtful approach in California that recognizes that group homes or our new short-term residential treatment centers are actually placements that are least restrictive than the locked facilities. And we have a process that with ongoing and regular checks in with the legislature so that we can kind of transition very thoughtfully from the current state to the future state. And as Kathy and Amy said, just sometimes, focusing only on the congregate care piece and assuming that the rest of the system lines up in its place to meet the needs of young people is a bit dangerous. Our approach has been, we believe, much more thoughtful. Kathy also talked about the 30-day requirement, so I won't get, for assessment, I won't get into that, but other than to say, assessments are often a process and not an event for the reasons that Kathy mentioned. And we have a process in place that would allow for decisions to be made for youth being in finding their emergency placements, into these short-term residential treatment programs. It remains to be seen how the assessment will be ultimately just worked through from the federal government standpoint. So our thinking is that the 30-day assessment provision may be a problem for us for the reasons Kathy mentioned, because of the complexity of the assessments needed and the fact that they are a process and not an event. Let me jump to the final slide for me, I think, quickly, as I see we're running out of time. What I wanted to mention is that we're worried that the Act could slow down our implementation. As I mentioned, we've spent a number of years working in a stakeholder process, followed by a bill that I mentioned that was passed last year, and a bill that's a follow-on bill this year to do a bit more clarification. And because we're changing all aspects of the system, simultaneously in a kind of a thoughtful, measured approach, we worry that if without the clarifications that we've asked for from the federal government, and potentially some of the amendments that were spoken about earlier, we think it will add confusion and to our implementation, and potentially provide options for some of the naysayers in California to say we need to hold off, we need to wait to do our reform because we need to see how the feds will be defining these things, or how law will change in certain ways, and oh, what about the money part too? So we have a genuine concern that we're out of the gate, and somehow this might create a number of hurdles for us to get over that we think it would be to the detriment of kids and families in California. And lastly, in terms of investments, as I mentioned, we've been working on capacity building before the initiative started, to the tune of well over $200 million of state funds being added to the program in the last few years, all in anticipation for this. If in fact we lose federal funding for many of the things that you've described, that were described earlier, we worry that these two, the ability to continue to sustain state resources for our implementation will be competing then with other needs throughout the system to fund things that will be no longer funded by federal funds. And so we think that some of the resources that we have put into the program to do the kinds of things we've described could be a jeopardy because they might need to be diverted to other places given the loss of federal funds. With that, I think that's the last of my slides, and I apologize that I ran right up at pretty close to the time.
Well, no, Greg, I think your timing is we do our best, right? So I just want to conclude by going back to Sean's point, bringing you back to how we arrived here, and understanding we all have the best interests of children and youth at heart. Anyone who dedicates their entire professional career to this field isn't in it for any other reason. And so, this set of facts has led us to the conclusion that we do feel Family First is flawed. We have asked members of the Senate to prevent its passage if we cannot amend it. And we're not just whiners. The amendments in statutory proposed language have been provided, and we're more than willing to work on seeing those introduced. So that's kind of where we're at. So let's jump to kind of questions and comments. This definitely breaks at least a John Burton Foundation record for questions and comments. We're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them. And if you need to drop off and just do so. I think we'll probably go for about 10 minutes, so that'll be a little bit over. But then after that, we're probably just going to need to wrap up. And any question that is posed that we're not able to answer during this time, we're happy to address offline. So the first question, maybe Kathy Senderling, if I can ask you. So what does this mean for a state who doesn't have a Medicaid expansion? We've kind of, from a public sector point of view, there are states that don't have a Medicaid expansion that doesn't pay for residential or other supports. How should they be thinking about this?
So thanks, Amy. I have a couple thoughts on that. The expansion under ACA, remember, is related to childless adults up to age 64. And so there may be an opportunity for your family-based coverage, which states typically offered under 1931B prior to the Affordable Care Act going into effect, to provide the types of mental health services or substance use disorder services that you, without regard to whether your state took advantage of the expansion. So you definitely would want to look into that possibility. And remember that another important piece that I think Angie referenced under the ACA is the requirement for mental health parity. So especially if you're in a state that has a managed care plan and a managed care structure that you offer Medi-Cal or Medicaid services to your families, both the families and the children, the parents and the children who are covered under Medicaid should be able to access those services. Now, I would agree that if you're in a state that has not opted into the expansion for childless adults, and you have a situation where a family might have been kind of broken apart already, in the sense that you've got the children placed with the relative and the parents are on their own, the parents may have lost eligibility for Medicaid, and that could be a concern. And our comment to that would be we're not really arguing that the bill should be stopped or somehow amended to remove these services. And I think that you could quibble and really gripe that it should have gone farther, it should have gone farther. We're not saying that the inclusion of those services is a fatal flaw. I think what we've been asking for is a recognition that, especially for those children placed with relatives, the inability to provide services directly to those relatives to support them and to support their caring for the children, coupled with that Title IV-E federal eligibility issue, are really what constitute one of the fatal flaws from our perspective in Title I. Not necessarily that you're providing those services, and in a state that has not taken up the Medicaid expansion, those could be very useful services to be able to tap into. So definitely to clarify that we're not asking that the bill in any way not offer those services, but just to say and sum up in response that even if you're not a state that's taken up that expansion, if you want to utilize those prevention services in the context of keeping the child with their biological parents, for example, you may have more flexibility that you would just want to explore with your state agency for Medicaid.
Okay, Kathy, this is a comment, but it's going to come right back to you because I want you to reflect on this comment. This person wants to make a comment on delaying the AAP-AFDC delinking. The comment is, the loss of FFP and cost shift to states extends well beyond 30 months. A 2-year-old adopted special needs child made ineligible for 4E reimbursement in 2017 will remain ineligible until 2033 when the child reaches 18 and age out of adoption assistance. Also, the CBO estimate did not factor in that the $720 million in adoption assistance cost shift to states also results in a loss of more 4E matching funds that states would receive if they reinvested the AAP savings in 4E, such as for allowable prevention services. Is that analysis jive? So this person is actually saying that the real cost of the delaying of the delink is even greater for states. Is that something CWDA is thinking about, or?
Well, I think that the first point that the commenter made is, number one, it's absolutely right on, of course, and I think that you see that in the CBO score, though I can certainly check the double check their methodology, and we can share an update to the group if given that we're going to be obviously having to respond to some questions offline given the time. Because what happens is, yeah, technically this is only a 2.5-year delay, but when you look at the 10-year CBO score, running it out over those 10 years, it grows over time. And I think that that is a recognition that really the federal government would have been putting more and more in over that period of time if only they had allowed the delink to happen on time. So I think they may have already accounted for that. But I think it's a really great point that to the extent that you would be using those dollars on possibly prevention services that could draw down more 4E, or if you are not a state that fully utilizes your 4B. Now California, and I know many other states, the 4B is so inadequate that we use ours in the first quarter of the fiscal year, and then we're done and we're on to other types of prevention. But if you're a state that does maybe not fully utilize its 4B, or could think about utilizing for services of that nature to draw down more funding, or to draw down funding from other sources, even if not under Title 4E, but perhaps under other types of programs that are available that you could use those funds as a match for, that is definitely saving the federal government even more money. And I don't recall seeing a discussion of that in the CBO score. I think they just did a straight kind of run out of us not having to provide that FFP for the AAP program. So I think it's a valid point.
Thanks, Kathy. So this I'm going to combine a few different comments and questions, and this is for you, Sean. So, you know, we kind of said at the beginning of our presentation, our goal here is not to kill this bill. It's to be productive partners and to offer amendments that will better protect children and hopefully even prevent maltreatment. But then we also heard that this is all very expensive, and likely if all of our amendments were scored, is it really possible in this legislative session, Sean, that our amendments could be included and a bill that achieves what we're proposing could happen? And if not, are we actually trying to kill the bill in this form?
No, we're not. I do think it's achievable. I mean, if you looked at the House Ways and Means markup, there were other offsets floated by Congressman Doggett involving the child support system that could easily finance, I think, the inclusion of our amendments. So I don't think it's impossible. I think certainly it's difficult to start the conversation about offsets and get both parties to agree, but there is money out there, and it's just about building the will.
Okay. Great. All right, so lots of comments and questions that are out there. I'm trying to just pick ones based on a variety of different topics. Hang on just 1 second. All right, so here's another one. Here's just a comment. And this is also about the D-Link. Oh, it's about the QRTP. So this is a comment, the impact of the QRTP nursing staff requirements, and this is, I'll reflect back to you, Kathy, just so you can be ready to reflect on this, is even worse because it applies to facilities as few as 7 beds, but at any point in time there are likely to be vacant beds and beds occupied by children who are eligible for ineligible to FFP due to the linkage to the 1996 AFTC eligibility rules. In LA County, only 40% of group home are federally eligible. As a result, only 3 out of 7 children placed in a QRTP may be eligible for FFP to help finance the added cost. I believe that federal law bars the state from having higher placements rates for federally eligible children than state-only children. So I guess I think what they're saying is due to the low penetration rate that that essentially states end up bearing a disproportionate cost of that new requirement. Does that square with you, Kathy, or do you have anything you want to, or just let that comment stand and move on?
Yeah, I would just say it is I agree with that way of thinking. I mean, it's not like we're running, and I'm sure other states are not able to as well, separate systems of congregate care facilities for children who are federally eligible versus those who are not, so that you're able to spread the costs accordingly. So if you've got a 6 or 8 bed facility and you've got, say, half and half, the only 3 of those kids in a 6 bed facility are actually pulling down federal funds that help cover the cost of that, and the nurse has to apply to everybody, so you're really having to split that around 6 kids. So it would be completely unrealistic to think that a state can somehow say, well, that facility I'm only going to draw down the federal funds for, and there I'll put the nurse, but this other one, that'll be all the federally ineligible kids, because we're placing them based on their therapeutic needs, based on their behavioral health needs, based on, for example, CSEC, like I mentioned, and so you can't really place a kid in that way. You have to put them in a program that works for them, really without regard to whether they're federally eligible. So it is perhaps an unrealistic way of thinking about it at the federal level, about sort of that we're not a homogenous kind of system where every kid looks the same and every kid is federally eligible. In fact, we're getting more and more away from that over time because of the Title IV eligibility requirements.
Okay, great. We're just going to buzz through a couple more of these. There's some really great questions, and I apologize because I know kind of throughout the web seminar I've written, I will ask, I will pose, but there's just no way it's actually going to happen because there's so many. But this one's for Greg. So Greg, in what ways, you detailed CCR, and a big focus of that is responsibly stepping young people down from a group home setting into a family, and that is a major focus. But in what ways does the California plan provide for investing in additional services to prevent child abuse and neglect? And I think that, from my participation in these conversations, it's certainly the prevention funding. People can kind of deal with the congregate care aspects of it, and who knows how those will play out, and they depend a lot on how the regulations go. But what are we doing in California on that front?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think the commenter, is right, or points out something that's important to, at least for this webinar, which is, yes, I've been focusing largely on the Title II aspects of the bill, and so what have we been doing for prevention and early intervention? The state has done some things relative to differential response. We have our Office of Child Abuse Prevention has funded a number of pilot projects, et cetera, throughout the state. I think one of the things that's really salient, though, about this question to think about, especially was, I think, Angie's comments early on, is that there is a question the state would have to make, or a question we'd have to consider. Are the federal funds that are narrowly available for prevention and early intervention, given the fact that we have Medi-Cal expansion, the ACA, a waiver for certain kinds of substance abuse disorder treatment, does it make sense to fund that out of 4E? And at the expense potentially of losing federal funds for those youth that might lose federal eligibility because of the home of removal that Angie talked about. We're not seeing a tremendous value in the prevention arena in this bill for the reasons that were described earlier. It certainly doesn't mean that we're not interested in prevention, and it certainly also doesn't mean that we've done all we can. We just think this will make some difficult choices for our state, the administration and the legislature, given the very narrow confines of the federal funds that are actually going to be available and to whom they're actually available for. I mean, we talked about this very briefly about the imminent risk. I would say that this whole thing around candidacy, our state has over and over again been asked to pay back federal funds because of our inability to appropriately document candidacy to the degree that the federal government is interested in, and same with many other states. So I think, I would just try to sum up by saying we do need to do more for prevention. It's important to us for the reasons I described and were talked about earlier. We're not so sure if Title I really gets us much more, and the trade-offs are significant for us to consider.
Thank you, Greg. So this one's for you, Sean. It's a big question, and maybe it's unanswerable, but the questioner said, please explain how California thinks there could be a better bill when every knowledgeable person in D.C., and there are some caps going on in there, that says that is not going to happen. So are we just, the land of fruits and nuts? Are we just out to school here? I mean, what do we know that every knowledgeable person in D.C. doesn't know?
How do you begin to answer that question? I think there needs to be a push, and it starts with the advocacy community, but it also extends to people on the Hill to finance expansion of child welfare services with resources that come from outside of child welfare. I think you're behind the 8 ball in trying to craft legislation that redirects funding from within the child welfare system. I just think there's no fat in this system. There's no easy place to draw down. When we wrote Fostering Connections, we got lucky because guardianship was scored as a saving, so we didn't actually have to restrict anything. But with this bill, as you're restricting funds for certain placements that some kids need, again, I just go back to the point, it undermines the continuum. I think there's a better bill that can be written, and it takes consensus that we're not going to settle for financing it from just within the existing funding arrangement.
Thank you, Sean, and sorry about sending you that kind of hard one. I would add to Sean's point of view is, California did not always put up $200 million to do the right things for children and families. We've seen in our own state a very interesting evolution in the importance of not trying to have policies be cost neutral or cost savings. And we believe that similar framework could be adopted on federal legislation. I think the last question we'll have, and a few people might have a point of view on this, but this literally is a question, and it's kind of the one that we always hope to get, but is how can we best support California's efforts to amend this bill? And let me send it first off over to you, Sean, and then anyone else who would like to chime in can certainly share their points of view. Sean, for people who are getting concerned about what they're hearing and think we can get a better bill, what should we be doing right now?
I mean, reaching out to the authors in the House and Senate and saying, California has some good policy solutions here, and we want to support their efforts to amend the bill. I mean, I don't know where the questioner lives, but if they live in D.C., go hit the Hill and talk to people, because we tried everything we can as a state, I think, to amend this thing. I think if there was more of a chorus of other people saying that it needed to be amended, that we can't just fix this bill through, attempts at technical assistance through HHS, maybe there would be more will to look at it again.
Mm-hmm. All right, Angie or Greg, anything that you would like to add in terms of a prescription of what people can do moving forward? I know, Angie,
I would just say if you, oh, this is Angie. If you are a group that works with kin caregivers, what I keep hearing as I listen to the messaging around this bill is that this is a bill that provides support for kin families, and that is really about meeting the needs of kin, and that's just not in this bill. There are no concrete supports or services for the kin families that we're expecting to care for children outside of the foster care system, and there's no investment in expanding and supporting the families that are going to need to be there in order to allow children to step down from group homes and be successful in these family placements. Neither of those investments are in this bill, and so I think having kin families and the groups that work with kin families really seriously consider what this is actually doing to support those families, and if those supports aren't there, and they're not, then making sure that folks on the Hill hear from you and hear, this isn't the bill I would have written. This isn't going to actually help me in caring for these children that I'm stepping up and caring for.
So trying to make that point, and I think, hopefully we will have the opportunity to continue to work together, to improve the bill and to move the child welfare system forward. For those of you, and there are many of you, that had very fair and excellent comments, and I just want to in particular recognize Nancy Young, perhaps our most prolific commenter and questioner, who just brought up a range of very poignant questions around the interrelationship between mental health, substance use, and child welfare. We do apologize. And we hope to continue this conversation. The session isn't over yet, but this was our effort to put our point of view forward, address some questions, hear some comments. So with that, I'm going to conclude today's web seminar. You will receive a link with the recording and the PowerPoint slides. I unfortunately only started pressing recording at the beginning of Angie's, so you won't hear my brief introduction or Sean's comments, but the real meat of the presentation we did capture so that you can share it with your colleagues or listen to it again if you would like to do so. So again, thank you very much, and that concludes today's web seminar.
Okay. I'm wondering if I want someone to